Okay, we may still have a few people trickling in. I know we had a somewhat shortened coffee break, which early in the morning seems like a crime. So thank you for getting here on time to start. My name is Jackie Suggitt. I'm with ReFed. I lead our multi-stakeholder initiatives work, which includes our work on packaging. So I'm very excited about the panel today. We have a lot of great people to talk to us and a lot of experts in the room. So look forward to your engagement as well. I'll start with some brief bios of our panelists. I'll let them add on to it as well during their presentations. Then we're going to allow each of them a few minutes to set the context and present on their issue area specifically. And then we'll open it up to the room. I have some questions I know I want to ask selfishly, but would also invite others to participate as well. And then perhaps before I read bios, just because this is timely, I was shared a LinkedIn article this morning on the role of packaging in reducing food waste, which I thought, oh, this is very timely since I'm moderating a panel on this in about an hour. But wanted to share just a brief blurb of this. I think kind of talks about some of the issue and context around both packaging reduction and food waste reduction and the intersection between those two issues that we're trying to focus on here. But it says, having enough food to feed the world is just one part of the equation. Food must also get to homes undamaged and unblemished and as fresh as possible so that the world's population can have total confidence in the safety of the food they buy. It's hard to believe that while wishing to reduce packaging, some will not tolerate an increase in food waste under their watch. The fundamental point here is that the carbon footprint of food and drink dwarfs that of its packaging. So it's a really interesting intersection that we're playing at here. With the very visible packaging around the product, but also the issue that a lot of us hold dear with food waste reduction. So I'm very excited about the conversation today. I want to thank the panelists for being here. And as quick introductions, right next to me we have Lana Suarez, who's with the EPA. She is the Associate Branch Chief in the Materials Management Branch that leads the sustainable management of food efforts under the Sustainable Materials Management Program at the EPA. Mm-hmm. So I hope I got all that right. Yep. Okay, good.
That's the abbreviated version. There's a lot more acronyms in between.
Thank you
I just skipped those.
You can tell us more during your presentation. Then we have Ron Cotterman, who is here from Sealed Air and also representing Ameripen. In his position as Vice President, Sustainability, Ron Cotterman is responsible for Sealed Air's company-wide strategy and sustainable business practices and works to advance sustainability innovation across Sealed Air's business units. And I do just want to call out that he is also here representing Ameripen. Ameripen is working with ReFed on our packaging work, co-hosting the working group that's happening during the summit. So thanks for your support in that. And then next we have Rob Kaplan with Closed Loop Partners. He's the co-founder of Closed Loop Partners, an innovative platform for impact investing, sustainability, and the circular economy. And then previously, Rob was the Director of Sustainability at Walmart stores, responsible for packaging, among many other things. That's actually where I first met Rob, so glad to have him back. And then finally, down at the end there, Rhodes Yepson from the Biodegradable Products Institute. Rhodes is the Executive Director of the Biodegradable Products Institute, North America's leading certifier of compostable products and packaging across North America. A nonprofit, the BPI's goal is the scalable diversion of organic waste to composting. So a really great group of people in the room here today. Again, want to thank them for joining, and we'll actually turn over the time first to Lana, and we're going to go down the line and give them each some time to share their thoughts.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm very excited to be a part of this session, and I'm also very excited about the working group on packaging that I participated in yesterday, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'm here to share EPA's perspective on packaging from our sustainable materials management perspective. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the other panelists' remarks and all of the comments that come from the audience today. Packaging is 30% of what our everyday trash is, what we throw away every day. So that is one of the things that we think about when we think about packaging at EPA. We have an annual report that goes out, our facts and figures report, that talks about everything that we throw away every day. Packaging is certainly a large percentage. And in 2015, our program shared a strategy where we had 3 priorities. Sustainable management of food, the built environment, and packaging were those 3 priorities. So I wanted to share that again with you all today so you know that packaging is a priority for the Sustainable Materials Management Program. And we are still building our strategy. That's a part of that on engagement. So that's another reason why I'm excited about this panel, the work group that's being formed at this event, and all of the work that we have ahead of us to reduce both food waste and reduce packaging. And our perspective is really that we need to look at these two things as a whole unit. If we're going to address food waste, we need to consider packaging. If we need to reduce packaging, we need to consider food waste at the same time. So again, we're still building our strategy for engagement on packaging, and that's why these types of events are so valuable, so we can hear the feedback from all of the stakeholders and everyone involved on this issue. We heard a little bit in the working group that started yesterday and that will continue today about how complex this relationship between food and packaging is. And there are a few examples that we use when we talk about this to make people start thinking about it in a slightly different way. When I think about the packaging and the food inside of the packaging as a whole, wrapping produce is one of those examples. That wrapping up a cucumber, for example, can extend the shelf life for weeks. So when you're thinking about reducing waste, if you're going to wrap up that produce, there are a lot of things to consider, not just the packaging end of life for that packaging and that film that's on it, but where's that cucumber going? Where did it come from? What kind of plastic is used? There's a lot of things to consider when you're talking about reducing waste and reducing packaging. Another example is coffee. We use this one a lot. Coffee comes in a variety of different types of packaging. Steel cans and plastic cans are some of those containers, and then a laminate bag is another option. Some are more impactful in the processing and development and the inputs that go into that packaging for steel cans and plastic cans, but they are more readily recyclable. And the laminate bags may have less input when you're talking about the transportation, but really right now they're not recyclable at this time. So that's just one more thing to consider when you think about all of the inputs that went into that packaging and then into the food that that packaging contains. And when we talk about our sustainable materials management program, that is something that aims to meet society's needs by using and reusing materials in the most effective and efficient way throughout the life cycle of that material, at the same time reducing environmental impacts. So we really try to use that way of thinking when we think about packaging and food waste, and that is important for us to, again, put it together and do some more analysis on that product as a unit with what's contained in the packaging and the packaging itself. There are a lot of higher input types of food that you'd have to consider when you're going to put it in some sort of container. And when you think about those inputs and how labor intensive it may have been to produce that food, and then when you want to transport it somewhere else, it may be worth, if your goal is to reduce food waste, it may be worth increasing the packaging if you're going to ultimately reduce waste. So again, just thinking about those two things together as a unit and not think about them separately. Ideally, in a perfect world, in a perfect system, we'd love to get all of these materials and packaging back into the system to create new products and have no waste to deal with at that end of life and disposal, but we're not in that perfect world right now. And in the meantime, we can use our existing system and opportunities and solutions and optimize those really so that we can get the most out of what we have right now until we get to that ideal space and that ideal, most efficient system possible. So I just wanted to, again, talk about that for EPA, packaging is a priority for us in our Sustainable Materials Management Program. We do encourage looking at the product and the packaging as a whole, as an entire unit. You can't just focus on one and think about it as we traditionally do at end of life, but think about the product and the packaging together. And then to really encourage life cycle thinking when we're making these packaging and food waste decisions. And again, I'm really looking forward to what our other panelists are going to talk about today and from all of the input that I'm going to hear from the attendees of the session.
Thank you.
All right. So hopefully the system will work. I have a few slides to introduce Ameripin to you. Most of you know the EPA, but you may not know Ameripin. So a little bit of intro. About a year ago, I wrote a blog and gave a conference presentation on how to fight climate change like a backpacker. Why is that relevant? Well, first of all, one of the big components of climate change, as we've heard, is greenhouse gas emissions that come from the wastage of food, et cetera. But it also came from personal experience. I don't know how many of you camp, how many of you hike, how many of you backpack. You don't want to carry or transport more stuff than you need. You don't want to waste anything that you carried into the woods. And you want to make sure you eat everything that you took, or maybe just looking at that as an ecosystem. That's kind of what we're trying to get to. But something happens to us as consumers when we go into restaurants, when we go into grocery stores, when we have large refrigerators, large pantries. We kind of forget that efficiency of the system. But also, this is about the value that the packaging brings. And I understand, there's concerns about packaging, and we're going to explore that nexus, if you will, the overlap of why you need packaging, what's the right amount, and what impact that has on food waste. Now, there's an organization that's organized to look after this topic, because one of the biggest concerns consumers have about packaging and food waste is, I can't recycle my packaging. Why is that? Well, it's very complex, as Lana has told us, and this organization was formed to help address the environmental concerns in the United States associated with packaging. It's called Ameripin. It takes a material neutral place. It's not about paper, it's not about plastics or metal, it's about all packaging. And we really try and attack issues that relate to the environment. We have a membership that spans the supply chain, everything from material suppliers to converters to retailers to even companies that manage the waste at the end. And so bringing that supply chain together, we're trying to work very hard on what are the policy solutions, what's the education needed, and trying to do a better job of informing around some of the key topics. We came out with a report earlier this year about the value of packaging and as it related to food. And this built on a study that came out from ReFed earlier. So we tried to take the ReFed report that talked about the interventions around packaging and explore that in a little bit more depth. Yes, there's a big target out there of what you could hit in terms of reducing food waste, and packaging is part of it. But how would you actually achieve that? What are the steps that you would take to actually reduce that food waste? So this report is available online, ameripin.org. Lana has printed out a copy. But I'm a sustainability guy, so I can't. But I'll tell you, it's available digitally. So it's a report that really lays out the case of why do you need packaging. Here's just one graphic, for example. If you look at the bars and it shows you the percent of food that's packaged, maybe a surprise to you, but France, the UK, and Germany actually package a higher percentage of their food than we do here in the United States. On the other hand, you look at the red line, and that's actually the amount of food that's wasted. And you see that Europe actually wastes less food. So here's one piece of evidence that packaging actually correlates a bit with the amount of food that's wasted. Lots of other variables, it's very complex. We also pulled some data and looked at studies here of why is food wasted? And here's a great study that was done back in 2013 of using ethnography and other factors within the UK households. We heard from RAP and their Love Food, Hate Waste campaign. Most of the food is wasted. Why? They don't use it in time. 54%. Food, most of it by its very nature, is perishable. So, of course, if you buy it, you don't use it in time, it ends up being wasted. We also did a study across the U.S. retail supply chain. This was sponsored by Sealed Air, where we looked at what's the number one reason why retailers are throwing away food. Because it's a lost money at the end of the day. Number one reason, expiration of the food date. Again, the perishable nature of the food is what's the leading cause. So how do you address that? And Lana also teed up this topic here, is that many, many foods can have an extension to their life after their harvest period, whether it's fruits, vegetables, whether it's meat, cheese, etc. Using packaging science, which is a discipline taught in, in many universities, by looking at the gas atmosphere around that food, you can actually make the cucumber to go from days to weeks, or the fresh red meat from 2 days to 21 days, etc. That's the food science associated with with shelf life of food.
Ryan, can you go back on that slide?
Yeah.
There's a few people trying to grab. Did you get it?
Oh, you want to take a picture? Okay. This is from a report that the Flexible Packaging Association put together, and so it's available online as well. But you can see here again just examples that most foods can have their, and it's not always the same solution, right? So you've got fruits and vegetables respire at different rates. So the atmosphere that you would need in that bag of lettuce would be different than what you need for a strawberry versus broccoli versus a potato. And food companies understand that. Similarly, what you need for turkey is different than what you need for beef. And so when you look at the packages in a retail store, you don't know that as a consumer, but as a food packager, we know that, for example, that they have to be packaged differently. Okay, so what's the problem? If you look on the right, and you like life cycle assessment, packaging is a very, very small piece of an overall supply chain. A few percent that protects the other 90+% of that supply chain, the amount that's from production, and that's from the poultry supply chain. But look at the chart on the left. This is work that we sponsored in a Harris poll that says, which is worse for the environment, packaging or food waste? So this is how the consumer is thinking. And I think this crowd may see some similarities in that and how you feel as well, that when you're asked that question, packaging material is usually called out as worse for the environment. Statistically or analytically, that's not the case. You can look at the carbon footprint of the amount of waste that goes into landfills. You can look at the carbon footprint of the amount of packaging that's wasted, and it's off by a factor of 10 to 1. But again, consumers are not analytical shoppers. And so those are the challenges that Ameripan is trying to address. How do we close that gap? And ultimately, it comes up to infrastructure. Now, we've heard this also. We have representatives from WWF here. I pulled a page out of one of your quarterly reviews as a WWF subscriber here. But a couple of years ago, we did a study of showing what happens when you wrap a steak. As I just mentioned, extending the shelf life. Or a cucumber, as Lana had mentioned, preventing the moisture loss of that cucumber. So food waste is one of these topics that unites. It not only unites across the aisle in Washington, as we heard this morning, but it unites NGOs with industry and other players. So, and then finally, again, we heard as well that you have to look at the system. There's an optimum, and what's interesting about this optimum is underpackaging is worse than overpackaging from a carbon footprint perspective, because when you underpackage and you allow food to spoil faster, that has a much larger impact than adding 10 or 15% more packaging. Now, that's not to say you should overpackage, but I'm just saying that if you want to be anywhere, you want to be near the optimum of that curve, and that's what a food packaging or a food scientist would look at. Okay, so finally, what came out of the value of packaging study? There are a number of categories of food that are probably where we're underutilizing packaging. It's not that they're not packaged. They're just not packaged with the technology that would extend their shelf life. So putting a dust cover over some fruits or vegetables so that you can sell them as a unit, but it doesn't extend the shelf life, is a lost opportunity to make some of those things. Or things that could be portioned, so buying things in bulk pack that otherwise could be portioned, as an example. But the second point is, but we really don't know once you get into a consumer home, for example. Say I gave you 12 days instead of 4 days on a particular food. Does that make you waste less as a consumer? Or do you just delay throwing something away? So I think this is still an area where more research is needed, and that's what we're going to try and tease out of the workshop a little bit later. But finally, the point is that this is a collaborative space. It's collaborative in many ways. That waste management infrastructure that's so sorely needed to enable packaging and recycling, as well as the reduction of food waste, government and industry have to come together on this, and that's where Ameripin is all about, trying to inform and advise that dialogue. So that's all I had, and we'll turn over to Ron.
Thanks, Ron. And thank you, Jackie, for the intro earlier. I should note that probably the most important piece of my bio that was not mentioned is I'm a steering committee member for ReFed, which is really why I'm here, and really proud to be a part of this organization and the work that we're doing here in partnership with the Harvard Law School, as well as moving forward. So when I do these types of presentations, I tend to try to avoid presenting to people who are smarter than me on any given topic. And as I look out in this audience, I see that I've completely failed in that goal. So I am very confident that I'm going to say some things here that folks in the room will probably disagree with and have much more experience, and so I very much welcome that and look forward to being corrected. I'm bringing a perspective of the investor to this panel. I co-founded an investment firm called Closed Loop Partners. My background, as Jackie said, is in the consumer goods and retail space. I used to lead sustainable packaging for Walmart. And now I operate in partnership with my firm two funds, Closed Loop Fund and Closed Loop Ventures. Closed Loop Fund is unique in that all the investors are large corporates. So we manage capital for Coke, Pepsi, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Walmart Foundation, Johnson & Johnson. And we invest in recycling infrastructure. We've deployed over $40 million now in collection, sorting, processing projects across North America. We also operate a venture fund called Closed Loop Ventures, which is focused on innovation in the broader circular economy. And that's where most of our packaging-related work is and investments are happening. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about our strategy, where we see packaging and investing as an opportunity to reduce food waste, and tell you about a couple of the investments we've actually made. So our firm is focused on advancing the circular economy, investing in technologies and business models that can divert waste from landfill and the environment and instead back into consumer goods supply chains. It's unique in that we're able to leverage our relationships and insights from our large corporate partners to learn how we can take ideas and innovations that we see and support them in a way that brings them to scale and connects to global supply chains. And we try to do that by identifying key bottlenecks that are holding back the circular economy and investing in solutions to unlock those bottlenecks. I will note that we focus a lot more in prevention and recycling than we do in recovery. So that's just from some context for this group. So one key insight and investment strategy that we've started to engage in is this reality of organics collection spreading across the country. So many municipalities, probably most of the top 10, have started a pilot curbside organic collection. And the reason they're doing this is because waste is a cost center for a sanitation department. Cities spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to manage waste. Most of that, about 40% of it is recyclables. So your recycling program will manage for that. And then another 40% is generally food waste. And so as cities are starting to say, how are we going to get our budget under control in today's environment, food waste and organic collection and organic waste management is becoming more and more of a priority. And more cities are trying to figure out how they do it. One of the challenges we face in this country is we have this legacy of segregated streams, right? So we started with landfill collection, waste collection. Then we started to strip out recyclables. And then we started to strip out organics. And as a result of that, we run 3 inefficient systems on top of each other rather than one integrated, holistic waste management system. And that causes a lot of inefficiency and a lot of cost that prevents different pieces of it from working together and maybe ways that would work better. One of the biggest challenges in food waste is the weight, right? In organics collection, it's just really heavy and there's not a lot of value to it. So as we started to think about where could we invest in that space, we looked at decentralized anaerobic digestion. So we invested in a company called Home Biogas, which is a household-sized anaerobic digester that broke a price barrier. It's a about like 2/3 of this table right here, and it is under $500. It's an Israeli company. They actually developed a technology for the Bedouins, so it's completely mobile and small scale. And you put all your food waste in it. It produces liquid fertilizer and natural gas. It would be basically a replacement for your backyard compost. And you could feed it right into your outdoor barbecue or your pool, particularly in spaces, parts of the country that are far apart and distributed, where you have a pool and an outdoor barbecue, right? That's the parts that are really hard to run trucks to go pick up everybody's organic waste because of the distance you're traveling. The further you have to travel, the less value you're able to capture from the material. So Home Biogas is a great company. They actually, as I said, they built it for emerging economies. They sell almost all of their products in Africa and India, but they've done a few kind of Kickstarter type campaigns here in the States, mostly a maker community here. But I see the future of that essentially an anaerobic digester type process being a white good, right? Like your refrigerator or your trash compactor in a new build house, where all of your food just goes in that appliance, rather than thinking about it as a separate process and waste management challenge. There's a whole circular economy model of fee for service there, right? Where instead of I'm charging you to run trucks to your house and pick up waste, I'm charging you to lease this appliance, and that takes care of all your waste, and you get energy created off of it. Another sort of part of this evolution that we see as we start to invest is as cities continue to roll out organics collection, contamination is a huge problem, right? Because you have to have clean streams. This is true in recycling. It's especially true if you're trying to compost something. If you're trying to compost something and you have plastic flakes in there, your compost product that you're selling is not going to be very valuable, right? You've got a contaminant. And one of the biggest challenges we foresee in the future is stuff like this, which is PLA. And everyone thinks it's super compostable, and it's great, but it doesn't compost unless you have a really sophisticated industrial composter. It doesn't compost in your backyard, and it doesn't compost at the same rate as food. So if you are running a business, and your business is based on how much feedstock you get, in this case food, and how much product you can put out the other end, in this case compost, and you could do it in 20 days or 30 days, but if you have a lot of this stuff in it, it's 45 days, it's 60 days, you have an operational challenge for running your business. And we've already started to see municipal situations where composters are charging fees and fines for contamination to municipalities for the quality of the material they bring in. So at some point you have to say that sometimes the city is going to say, like, I don't really want to pay that fee or fine anymore. What are the alternatives to compostable plastics that we could really work on, and thinking about it, defining that compostable as things that don't cause me fines. So we invested in a company called Lollyware. It's a plastic alternative. They make cups and straws out of essentially a seaweed product. So it is actually food. And they have a whole marketing campaign around it's edible. And they have flavors. And it's kind of fun. It actually was on Shark Tank. Mark Cuban is the lead investor, too. They we invested in them a couple of years ago solely because of this idea of what is truly compostable materials to invest in and innovations that could scale as you start to see these types of regulatory or markets shifting. Then this whole thing called ocean plastic sort of freaked everybody out. And then this whole thing about straws has freaked everybody out. And they're very well positioned to develop a straw product that is hyper-compostable and actually could go into the ocean and it wouldn't matter. And there's actually a functional benefit. So I want to get to this third part, which is like, you can sell a premium product like a PLA package as much as you want, but there's only so many people who are going to buy it for the environmentally beneficial reasons. Lollyware, they sell fun flavors, and it's a functional product. You can have an iced tea with a lemon-flavored straw. Right? There's a story to tell there, and we see that as a huge opportunity to bring consumers into this equation. And that's where packaging becomes the most important part. We heard this story already about wrapping produce in cellophane. The number one way consumers engage with food at the start is through the package, right? That's how they interact with it. And it causes a huge problem, right? I remember at Walmart, we had this 3-pack of peppers that's wrapped in cellophane, and people would just walk right by it. It's fresher product. It's better. It should sell better, but people think, oh, it's packaged in plastic. That's not fresh for me, even though the product is fresher than the peppers sitting next to it. So there's how do we leverage and invest in packaging that can make that consumer choice easier, not harder? We talked to Blue Apron for a while about their challenges in this space, and one of their benefits from a sustainability point is that you reduce your food waste, right? Because you have perfectly portioned food, and they're a great example of how people can reduce food waste. But the top 2 reason why consumers don't continue with Blue Apron is the packaging. Like, that's a big problem if you're a subscription service. You need repeats. And if the number 2, number 3 reason why people are not re-upping is because they feel guilty every time they use your product, you've got a business problem that packaging can unlock or hold you back. So those are just a few of the investments we've made and kind of how we think about the investment strategy. But I look forward to being corrected by many of you and also your questions. Go ahead, Rhodes.
Yeah, thank you. I think I come at things from a slightly different perspective. So we look at really at the end of life. So when the food is no longer edible and needs to be composted, and so really at compostable packaging being essential if we're going to be able to scale organic subversion. So there are some similarities. I think the rest of the panel really outlined this idea of the problems of managing material streams separately. So looking at plastic, paper, glass in isolation. And I think that's especially problematic with food waste. As was already talked about, packaging can reduce food waste by extending the life of the food. But once that food is inedible, packaging is either a barrier or an enabler for composting. So I think we need a comprehensive approach to address food waste in packaging in Canada. So I think compostable plastics always have to be talked about in that context of the organics diversion problem. The infrastructure in the United States is still quite small for food waste composting. It's a majority yard trimmings composting due to landfill bans. There is a fair amount of effort around pre-consumer food scraps collection happening, which makes sense. It's fairly easy to separate, fairly easy to compost, and yard trimming sites are being adapted, re-permitted to accept that food. But the majority of what's sent to landfill in the United States is still food waste. It's the number 1 item, followed by paper and wood. And yard trimmings, adding all that up, it's more than half of what's going to landfill is organic. So it's barely scratching the surface. So we really need to get into post-consumer food scraps collection, and I'd argue that we need to redesign the non-recyclable food packaging to be compostable. So looking at that infrastructure in a broader way, Biocycle's State of Organics recycling study from last year sort of shows that breakdown, right? So the majority of those facilities are yard trimming sites. But if you start to go into the details of these other categories of sites that have been adapted to take food waste or that are designed specifically for multiple organics, the on-site at institutions, so the lack of infrastructure has led corporate campuses and universities and supermarkets to set up their own facilities to handle food waste. It's actually about 1,600 facilities that may be eligible to take food waste. So it's not as small or bleak of a situation as you may think. So how does that fit in with packaging? What is a compostable product? Very simply, it's something that's designed to biodegrade in a composting environment. To do that, you need to test the product. There have to be standards, and it has to be labeled in a clear way. And that's where our organization came in as a nonprofit. And as Jackie already mentioned, our goal is about scalable organics diversion. Where we fit into that is verifying that the products and packaging will break down without damaging the quality of that compost. It is difficult to label compostable products. unlike other claims, just because of the lack of infrastructure in the United States, because of the confusion around home composting versus industrial composting. So as you can see, our label can be quite complex with all of its disclaimers. We do try to make it easier. We're always looking at new versions of the label, working with the Sustainable Packaging Coalition on the How to Compost label as the sister to their How to Recycle label. We recently spent a lot of time upgrading our database of products. So you can go in and search by keyword or by category to find a compostable product. We have it broken down by SKU so that you know you can check the specific item you're holding in your hand, or if you're purchasing the specific box that you have in your warehouse. And currently we have a running tally, and it's around over 7,000 products that are certified. The other way that we fit into that zero waste picture of scalable organics diversion is that we're not certifying just any product that meets the ASTM standard. We're a little bit different than a lot of other certifiers in that regard. So we're only looking to certify products that make sense in the organic waste diversion world. So if only part of the item is compostable and it would need to be disassembled, it's not a slam dunk for certification. We have to talk through, see how likely it would be that a consumer could actually separate that item. If it's something that's readily recyclable, like a water bottle, then again, it has to take consideration about the context into which those are being sold. I think the clear PLA cup is a good example of that, where it can be confusing. And then if the item isn't associated with desirable feedstocks like food scraps and yard trimmings, composters might not want it, and we need to talk through those things. So as sort of the last person to introduce this topic on the panel before going into questions, I put up some of my own views of what the problems and solutions are that I see from where I sit, and I broke them into infrastructure limitations and packaging limitations. And so infrastructure limitations, I would say the really big one is the limited access for curbside food scraps collection. So again, from a biocycle data from last year, it's only about 4% of households nationally in the US who have access to food scraps collection. And only about half of that number can put compostable products and packaging into their bins. So only about 2% of the US could compost the compostable packaging in their curbside bin. Then there's the limited number of composting facilities, which we showed it's not as bleak as you may think, but it's still not enough to handle these burgeoning programs. As we heard this morning from Catherine Garcia, just the volume of waste coming out of New York City. So we're nowhere close to being able to handle that. And then there's no standard practice for industrial composting. What that means is there's a wide range of composting conditions that it's going to make it really difficult for us to design properly how to get packaging and food waste out of the landfill. For packaging limitations, the two biggest concerns that come up are cost and availability of compostable materials and performance criteria for a wide range of food applications. And the solutions for those potential solutions, I would say for infrastructure, there are a lot of ways that people can get involved that are already moving forward. So there is a model permit rule for states on food waste composting, so ways to make it easier to permit food waste composting. So that could be getting involved with the US Composting Council, or in your state, working with legislators, lobbyists that you have, and saying, hey, this is something that we want to help a specific state on to make it easier to boost infrastructure. There are also a lot of bills out there right now around allocating more funding for recycling and food scraps composting, like Michigan Senate Bill 943, which would increase the landfill surcharge, so bringing it out of the cents range and putting it into the dollar range of their sister states, so they actually have some funding. Promoting a third bin for food scraps collection as a model for all communities, and standardization of industrial composting practices. So we are working on that, developing a standard for industrial composting to make sure that we're designing for the right criteria and facilities are being set up with the same criteria. And then finally, specific to packaging, I think that there's a lot of the chicken and egg discussion about whether we should be switching things to compostable before the infrastructure is there. And I think that at the very least, we need to start looking at that in a deeper dive about what are those non-recyclable food and packaging items associated with food, and how do we redesign them to either be recyclable or compostable. And I know that's a lot, and I'm talking quickly because I want to leave time for questions, but I'll leave you with a slide from the Sustainable Packaging Coalition that really gets at that, right? So they've done some work recently on the potential divertibles from QSRs all the way to large one-day music events. And breaking it down into these categories, I think, is a nice way of thinking about it. So you have, for compostable, you have food scraps and compostable packaging. in paper, you have recyclables, but in the landfill, you have future recoverables and unrecoverable. So we need to be really looking at those future recoverables and setting the stage for the infrastructure that's growing. So, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you to all our panelists. As you can tell, we have a lot of different perspectives up here and different backgrounds. So I hope it's already been a provocative discussion, and I hope we can continue that with your questions and comments as well. So I'm going to start with one for the panelists, and then would encourage you to be thinking, and we'll turn to you in just a second. But as we've all heard and seen, a lot of businesses and governments are setting commitments and policies around both packaging reduction and food waste reduction. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, do those compete, do those support each other, and how can we be setting better commitments and policies around those two issues? If anyone wants to start in particular.
I can start. I mean, we're seeing a lot of commitments in all of the areas where we work in our sustainable materials management program. There are a lot of different areas, and we do see a lot of progress where there are high-level commitments. In sustainable management of food is another example, but packaging as well. I don't know about competing, but I think that we are very encouraged when companies at a very high level set some very ambitious goals. There are a number of companies that have some very ambitious goals around packaging. Coca-Cola is one of them that has a goal of collecting and recycling 1 can or bottle for each it produces. That's a fact I just learned recently, and again, we're really encouraged by that type of commitment. And then the American Chemistry Council and Plastics Europe also set a goal of reusing and recycling 100% of plastic packaging by 2040, which I think is another very high, ambitious goal that we are encouraged to see.
And I think technology is going to help here. And as I think about it, you know, if you move forward to try and like remove or eliminate packaging, there's often unintended consequences. That if your food waste went up, were you better off or worse off? So I think that the answer is relative to where is technology going. I'll just cite 2 different efforts that are underway right now. One has to do with what's being done at existing MRFs, for example. How do you set up so that MRFs can accept what?
What's a MRF?
Oh, a material recycling facility. How do you set up so that your curbside bin can accept a broader selection of materials? So the American Chemistry Council is sponsoring a material recovery for the future program right now, where they're actually conducting trials at municipalities, and in this case it's going to be in Pennsylvania, to be able to look at, can you separate flexible plastics from paper, for example. So a very basic kind of concept, but for a facility that probably wasn't designed to accept flexible plastics at all. And so that's one example of something that's going on. The second thing is, we can't always just rely on today's recycling technology. That, you know, the energy and the material value that's embedded in those plastic materials that are extending the shelf life, is there any other way to extract the value out of that? And so I've been very encouraged what I've been seeing around you know, the use of chemical recycling. In other words, the ability to take and rearrange some of those molecules and put them back into another useful form. The technologies that are used are called things like pyrolysis, gasifications, and they align very, very nicely with today's commercial chemical processing operations. So I think we're going to see a lot of innovation, probably in the next 5 to 10 years, of setting up new collection schemes, such as one of the Ameripen members, Dow Chemical, sponsored a program called the Energy Bag, where they would ask in a municipality for consumers to put their non-recyclable plastics in a bright orange bag that was removed at the municipal recycling facility and then diverted to another technology. So I think we're going to see a combination of lots of different stuff, evolution of how we recycle today, new recycling technologies, and new ways to have the consumers engage in those processes. So I'm optimistic about the future, but it's going to take a little bit of time.
Robert Rhodes, any additional comments there?
None from me.
Yeah, I would just say that I think, to echo what Ron is saying for recycling programs, and that you need your program and your infrastructure to match. So for recycling with the material recovery facilities, I'd say the same thing for composting programs. And one of the things that we see is that, you know, in the effort to get pilot programs launched around the country for food scraps collection and composting, that there are a lot of struggles along the way in terms of what's accepted, what's not accepted. And there are sort of two different approaches to that. And one is making it a smaller list of what's acceptable with the idea that you can add items later. And the other one is sort of an all-inclusive, let's make it as easy as possible, and then we can always scale back or solve it with infrastructure. And I would say sort of the two programs on the opposite side of that would be New York City and Austin, Texas. And so Austin started with a food-only program going into the yard trimmings bin. They had a free contract with their composter with the guarantee that there was going to be no contamination. And then as they've started to roll out more and suss it all out, now paying, I think, for their contract for composting, they've started to add in items like compostable paper and bags for households to use. New York City, on the other hand, has, as we heard this morning, to get that participation and make it easier for households, allows residents to line their curbside bin with a clear polyethylene bag. And there are pros and cons to both of those, but I think from a policy side and how you balance that food waste diversion and packaging issue, that we really have to match those programs how we want them to be. And even though a pilot program might be a way to test the waters, it's how the education starts going, and it's really hard to take those things back. And we could end up with infrastructure that we really is not best suited. I would argue that $500,000 shredding and sorting machines up front could potentially be avoided in some programs with a different set of plans.
Thanks very much. Questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Dreisen with Sustainable Packaging Coalition. Rhodes, I wanted to ask if you'd be able to elaborate on what you see the potential of compostable packaging for one-bin systems. I think there's some super exciting examples in that field. I know through support with eco products, the Seattle Mariners, Safeco Field has achieved 96% diversion, and compostable packaging is a really critical piece of that, so curious.
Yeah, it's not going to work everywhere, obviously, but there's some really great examples of establishments where the majority of what they have is already food. So a stadium is a good example of that. A fair amount of restaurants are good examples of that. And the difficulty of sorting and consumer confusion, I mean, you can see it even at our own event here. It's tricky to figure out what goes in what bin. And some of the items that are brought in for the event might not match what was here before with their regular sorting system on their bins. The PLA cup is a good example of that. So on the blue bin at our event, it says that clear plastic items go into the recycling bin. But as Rob mentioned, that's a compostable PLA cup. It's not a polypropylene cup. And the two paper items that we've had at our delicious meals, one is compostable and one is not. They're from the same company. And so I think that the more you can go to, for certain businesses, certain events where you can go to a single stream, we've seen this amazing ability to get super high diversion numbers, really low contamination numbers. You think about it like a typical fast food restaurant that a lot of times has a one bin system right now for trash. So if you can kind of convert that seamlessly, the consumer doesn't even really need to know that everything has gone all compostable, and it just goes into one bin.
I forgot to just add that because we've got SPC here. I failed to call out the how to recycle label. So just as there's confusion about composting, there was also confusion about what can I put at the front of my grocery store that says I can accept bags and things like that, or articles. And so I think the SPC has stepped up and put together a how to recycle label to help avoid some of that confusion. So you're putting the right stuff in the right place, and you're not putting stuff where it actually would probably be a contaminant to today's municipalities. So again, kudos to the SPC for championing that work.
Yes.
And I just wanted to build off of what Rhodes was saying, which Lana brought up too. Another data point, if anyone's not familiar with the new plastics economy, I recommend looking that up. They put out several reports, one of which a couple years ago was the report that said by 2050 there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish if we don't change our way, right? So the first report was super depressing. The second report laid out a preferred approach to plastic packaging. And their recommendation, their term was nutrient-contaminated packaging, right? So packaging that comes in contact with food. Their recommendation was to shift that to compostables. Rhodes just really described why that works in a situation like this or in a restaurant. But packaging, it's so small, it can be made of so many different substrates. It's really hard to actually pull that out of the waste stream and find someone that's going to buy it and recycle it in the traditional sense. And so this report has the support of Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Unilever, Just, I think, a really important report that is contributing to this conversation.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, I was gonna talk about the inconsistency issues in terms of, you talked about the inconsistent processes, at the composter level, but I also think it's really confusing at the consumer level too, when you see these compost products because of the lack of standardization. And this has kind of been, I just wanted you to kind of comment on that, and I was in terms of, the quality and the properties matching how much they pay for it. And I think the consumer goes for the low dollar bid, but they don't really realize the different kinds of properties that the compost products could have or do have when they pay. I don't know if that makes any sense. Do you agree, or how do we address that?
Yeah, I mean, the consumer trends and why people are buying particular items and the interest in more sustainable options, I think there's a lot to suss out there. I think that sometimes consumers, whether that's an individual or a business sourcing, which clear cup, it could be about compostability, or it could just be about the front of life benefits. So being bio-based, switching from styrofoam to a molded fiber item, or from polypropylene to PLA, and it might not have anything to do with the end of life in that consumer's mind about why they're making that switch. But as far as clear labeling and helping consumers, I think there's been a lot of discussion about that from a food waste perspective, but also packaging in that intersection. I think that the missed opportunity there is being able to use the two to educate about both. So the example I like to use is so in a supermarket, things like a shopping bag or a produce bag, where you could switch that to a compostable application, charge for it maybe, reduce the volume, the number used to start with, but then use that as a communication piece about the food that you're bringing home, and then make sure that it's sized right to fit into your kitchen catcher at home. I don't know if that really answers though.
Yeah, I didn't ask it very well, but one thing that strikes me about the labeling issues about just compost products, as well as I was thinking compost products is, I kind of sense that we're kind of where organic was 20, 25 years ago, that people were throwing around these terms, and we know all composts are not equal. And how does a consumer decide which one they want to buy? Because I think they just go on price. They don't realize, is this one a good fertility? Is this one going to be phytotoxic? Is this one going to be
sure? Well, this
bark, or what are, and they're just all over the place.
And that's what our certification attempts to do,
Yeah.
is make sure that things have been tested for the whole suite of tests, right? So for compostability, people often think about just the physical breakdown of an item in a composting facility, and that's what we talk a lot about with the standardization of composting practices. It's just about the disintegration, the physical breakdown. But to your point, so the reason why certification is so important in our mind for compostable items is that there are all these other tests that are really important about plant toxicity, heavy metals, biodegradation, so the bioaccumulation of the raw materials going into the item. And so really, I think it is such a complex topic that it needs to be a certified item. It's not something like in other areas where it can just be a self-made claim.
I just wanted to reiterate something that Ron was talking about a little bit earlier, which is like, and this is just my own point of view on this, but if we start going down the path of solutions that depend on consumer choice and behavior, we're in real trouble in this country, right? Americans are lazy. We have trouble following the instructions here, and we're like the biggest champions of this cause in the country, let alone, at scale around the country, around the world even. But especially here, you can't tell Americans to do certain things and expect them to follow through on it. We know that, and we've learned that time and time again on recycling. So I do think that there's a pathway here that Ron started to talk about, which is like, how do you manage the treatment after it's consumed? How do you manage the product design so that it meets that treatment and that infrastructure? And you're investing in systems, companies, and infrastructure and materials that deliver on a circular system and circular economy. But if we depend exclusively on people following sorting instructions every day, we will never achieve the scale of diversion that we're looking for and the reduction of food waste that we're looking for.
Yeah. And we're a material producer. We make packaging. We would make a very different packaging if composting was the final solution. We would make very different packaging if mechanical recycling was the only solution. So, we follow the signals of the marketplace in terms of what the solutions are. And up to now, the encouragement from policy was be resource efficient. Use less resources to do the job that you need to be done. Those signals are changing. You see that in Europe. It's changed from resource efficiency to recyclability, for example, and partly because of the Ellen MacArthur work is a result. So industry is working to respond right now, but we need clear signals of what the future is going to look like. Because I think you're right. Yeah, we can't rely on consumer intelligence around packaging formats to.
And I want to build on that a little further, perhaps, Rob, and bring that to the prevention side and some of the conversation we had just on even your slide of how the spoilage prevention packaging and how that can affect the shelf life of food, and the differences in consumer perceptions of plastic on peppers, for example. So what's the role of consumer education or reliance on consumer behavior on the prevention side when we're perhaps adding packaging in areas they don't want to see it? Any thoughts there?
I think you do it in a way that delivers a functional benefit to the consumer rather than, for the sustainability benefit.
Yeah. I use the example of the poultry supply chain. If you go backwards 25 years, most poultry at that time was purchased as a whole bird. And then it became purchased as cut up parts. And then it became purchased as boneless parts. And then it's marinated. So food companies have been adding value along the line as part of that evolution, because we've been trying to understand what motivates consumers, and ultimately it's about time and convenience, and those are the two things that tend to be big motivators. The point of purchase decision is this packaging compostable, recyclable, whatever, usually was a secondary consideration after you had bought the product and you're standing there above your trash can like, well, what do I do with this kind of thing? And so we just kind of think about that what motivates consumers often is not packaging. It's something that affects their lifestyle, like convenience or saving time.
I would add to that. I think we're getting to a stage where it doesn't have to be about a trade-off with that either, right? And so I think a good example of that is this morning we heard about how in New York City the pretzel bags at schools were a major contaminant, and you might be able to tell by now that I used to work for Biocycle, but in the latest Biocycle magazine there is a profile about compostable pretzel bags, right? So, and peanut bags. So it's there, it's available, and I think we can sometimes we're at that stage where we can make that switch where it's not about a trade-off anymore. So it's a fully functional snack bag, and there are a lot of companies working on that so that you don't have to sacrifice the quality, and the consumer might not even need to know. They might not need to make the decision about, oh, I'm going to buy this snack because it's in a compostable bag. It's just, no, this is going to be, get into the policy angle of this is what's going to be allowed in an area that has a composting program.
Other questions? Yes.
When you think about Ameripen, Ron, I'm really encouraged by sort of that this organization exists. I've been thinking a lot lately about waxed cardboard and produce, and can we get out of it? And it's starting to happen, but it's very grassroots. It's very sort of one company at a time. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking like Refed partnering potentially with Ameripen on a project like waxed cardboard, so that we can encourage the waste reduction from the food side, but also from the cardboard side. We sort of can kill two birds with one stone, not birds, but
but that's exactly what you have to do. You have to align that supply chain, right? Everything from at the end, how do you recycle that, to what's the functionality you need in the middle of the supply chain, to at the beginning, what do you make it out of? So that's what we're trying to do, and then partnering with Refed through panels like this and other projects will help identify, okay, what are the projects to actually make a difference?
We could add that one.
Okay. All right, Jackie.
It's really interesting. Wax cardboard is making its way into the organic delivery, which makes me absolutely crazy, because there's so much extra wax cardboard now that they can buy it at a cheap price, and it's kind of ironic that we're receiving this beautiful organic product in the wax box. Mm-hmm. That would be a great project.
Yes.
I'm curious. We haven't really talked at all about sort of the China market and the fact that certain cities are actually turning away from even blue bin recycling. And I'm curious, you were, Ron, talking about sort of watching the market and determining how you're going to make your packages that way. And I guess, if you see that, for instance, compostability, if there's, the ability to look inward and we can actually support that kind of infrastructure rather than rely on, sort of volatile global markets, wouldn't that sort of be a direction to incentivize more compostable packaging, especially when, you know, food waste is one of the major contaminants in blue bin recyclables. Yeah. I'm just curious how that's factoring into sort of the... Well,
I can give you kind of a general industry perspective because I'm pretty well connected to my competitors and my suppliers and my customers and in that realm. And right now, there's a huge push on what can we do to put recycled content into packaging, including food packaging. What can we do to, you know, evolve the package design to enable it to be more recyclable? And number three, what's the infrastructure that has to be pushed very fast to be able to recover? I mean, these are the Ellen MacArthur, you know, key points here. You have to create a whole supply chain. It's got to have demand. Just being able to collect something and not have a market for it is just a cost somewhere in the system. So there's got to be a demand as well. And so colleagues like Waste Management know this all too well, that you can collect anything, but if there's no demand, the value that exists in the marketplace is compromised. So that's what industry is saying, my gosh, we have got to move more quickly. I think China was a very interesting catalyst for that, to make that, because it was too convenient otherwise to just bail materials out of sight, out of mind, went off to China. We don't have that anymore, and it's unlikely to come back in any form like it was in the past. So it's a call to action for industry, whether it's compostable, whether it's recyclable. I mean, that's what we're trying to figure out right now. But there's a huge investment being made within the packaging industry behind the scenes.
Yeah, can I ask you, Lana, what is your perspective on this issue from a policy point of view? I mean, we were talking about the hierarchy, we were talking about sustainability. China is impacting all these quite heavily. Ron is talking about solutions that the industry is going to be trying to find, but they are not there. Do you have a perspective on how policy can help shape the infrastructure here?
I really think that policy has to be driven by localities and specific municipalities and what's available and the infrastructure that's available. I don't think there's one national policy that can get us that industry response that we're talking about to create those markets and develop that market domestically. I think we really look to individual states and municipalities to see what they have available and to make those decisions on a local level.
Well, there's one I'd like to put a pitch in for. It's not an EPA, but it's the R&D tax credit, because companies will invest in innovation much more vigorously. It's been shown if we get that tax credit, and every year that has to be renewed in Congress. And I'd love to see some continuity there about stimulating the innovation within industry to make these kind of things happen.
So to follow up on the question about the takeaways in terms of the supply chain and not relying on China, it feels to a certain extent like the packaging industry and its associated brands. So it doesn't feel circular. It doesn't feel like enough effort is being made on the part of packaging design, packaging content to enable it to get back. So it's a supply chain horizontally, like you make the packaging, they put the food in it, it goes to the consumer, then it ends up in the waste stream, and ultimately the burden ends up on the recycling facilities, the composting facilities, to pull that apart. And that's a huge burden, and the associated costs don't seem to be shared across that supply chain. So I think it's really important. The circular economy concept is very strong, but all players have to be willing to play. And right now, and I'm looking at the last few months of coverage of where to point the fingers on why there's so much contamination in recycling. And what's really interesting, we come from the organics recycling part, but it's the same darn problem, and it's gone on now too long. So I'm not trying to, but I just
that's what you're trying to solve.
Yeah. So
I'm an old generation on this,
that.
Doing this, but there's a lot of new people.
Yeah.
So I think we really just got to lay the cards on the table.
Thanks, Nora. That's why our fund was created by industry, is to invest in those projects. But there's one reality I would point out, and this is just from my own perspective of working in consumer goods and retail for 10 years. Packaging is going to get more complex. It's not getting more standardized. We've been knowing about the evolving bale. I'm calling it the evolving bale, which means it used to be when we built recycling facilities, there was just like PET bottles and aluminum cans.
phone books.
And phone books. Now when you go into an aisle at Walmart, the puzzles are no longer in boxes, they're in bags, right? Like there is flexible and film everywhere because it's really convenient for all of the consumers and they love buying it and it's cheaper, right? And like I don't see save for some kind of regulatory shock, like consumer changing that drive. I see brands and companies trying to meet that consumer need in growing ways, which is what I was trying to make the point of and why Closed Loop Fund was created in the first place is like investments in technology and the infrastructure to collect, sort, process that stuff and domestic end markets is a key pathway to doing that. I think the reason the brands that we work with, Coke, Pepsi, Procter, are doing this because they don't want to be in the recycling business. Many of them have tried and failed and have tried to get out of it as much as possible. But the infrastructure needs to be built and needs to be built in a way that's connected to their design programs. And that's an evolving challenge that we try and work on a lot.
Just a comment to build on this, thank you, is I come from the packaging world. And I think when you look at circular economy, there's no one person that can push the wheel. So it's not just packaging that has to evolve. Everything has to happen to begin to pull. And we are in the infancy, but we're also going to begin to do our share to pull and push from the packaging industry. But everyone has to push the wheel, because alone, it's not going to change or make any economic sense. So it's the manufacturers, it's the reusers, it's the entire virtuous cycle that has to gain momentum. And the faster we can gain momentum, the quicker we can change things.
Awesome. Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, Chris Hunt with Refed. This has been a fascinating panel. It's actually the first breakout session that I've seen in its entirety, which is one of the regrettable aspects of hosting a conference is that you don't actually get to see too much of it. My question though is, how do we most efficiently promote solutions? Is this a matter of policy? Is it a matter of regulation? Is it more on the consumer education side to increase demand for some of these solutions? Is it the investment, Rob, in finding these new technologies that are going to make it easier to sort of achieve the objectives that we're talking, or is it some combination of all those?
I mean, I think the point that was just made is really sort of a key part of that response, which is it's all of the above. And that's the problem, is that this is a system problem. And when you're dealing with a system problem, you need a system solution. You can't point at one part in that system and be like, you guys have to fix it, right? Because they're only one slice of a pie and they're dealing with other decisions that have been made. That's one of the trickiest parts of this, is that there has to be a unified strategy towards circular economy, and there has to be investments aligned to that. There have to be purchasing decisions, design decisions, all moving towards that same goal.
I think that's a really great forward-looking question to kind of conclude our panel today. So any final comments on that, just looking forward and the solutions, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, just applaud Refed for kind of picking this space to do more working, because as you can understand, it's very complex, and I think you'll find some fruitful areas to really advance.
Wax cardboard, I've already got it written down. Awesome, well thank you for joining us. If you want to continue the discussion, we have a working group right after lunch, so feel free to join us there and help me thank our panelists.